The coffee was terrible. The kind of terrible that makes you question your life choices. But I kept drinking it anyway because the alternative was admitting I'd wasted $4 on liquid regret. I was hunched over my laptop in Corner Café, pretending to work on a client proposal while actually watching a woman at the corner table sketch something that looked suspiciously like the grumpy barista. She had this focused intensity, like she was trying to capture his soul through pencil strokes. And honestly, good luck with that, because Tommy the barista looked like his soul had left the building around 2003. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That's when she looked up, caught me staring, and instead of the awkward eye dart away, dance most people do, she smiled. Not a polite smile, but the kind that suggested she found something genuinely amusing about the whole situation. He's not actually that grumpy, she said, loud enough for me to hear across the small cafe. He just has resting existential crisis face. Tommy snorted from behind the espresso machine. I heard that, Rachel. You were supposed to, she shot back, then looked at me again. You're new here, aren't you? I would have remembered someone who drinks coffee like they're being personally offended by it. I glanced down at my cup, realizing I'd been grimacing with each sip. Is it that obvious? The facial expressions give it away. She stood up, walked over to my table uninvited, and slid into the chair across from me. Up close, she was striking. In that effortless way some people manage, with paint under her fingernails and laugh lines that suggested she used them frequently. I'm Rachel, and you look like you could use a coffee intervention. Justin, I said, automatically closing my laptop. And yes, this is genuinely awful. Tommy makes it strong enough to wake the dead, but he's never quite mastered the art of making it taste like anything other than bitter disappointment. She signaled to Tommy. 2 of the good stuff, please. And don't pretend you don't know what I mean. Tommy rolled his eyes, but started working on what I assumed was a secret menu item. Rachel turned back to me, studying my face with the same intensity she'd been giving her sketch. So, Justin, what brings you to our little corner of nowhere? Running from something? Running to something, or just lost? The directness caught me off guard. Most people in small towns were either immediately suspicious of outsiders or overly welcoming in that aggressive way that made you feel like you were being recruited for something. Rachel was neither. She was just genuinely curious. Running from, I guess, I admitted. Corporate burnout. Spent 5 years in Chicago doing digital marketing for companies that sold things people didn't need to people who couldn't afford them. Woke up one morning and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt proud of anything I'd done. She nodded, like this made perfect sense. And Millbrook seemed like the logical antidote to corporate soul-crushing. My buddy Marcus lives here, owns an antique restoration shop, offered me a job and a fresh start. I shrugged. Seemed like the universe giving me a sign. Or Marcus giving you an excuse to hide from your problems in a place where the biggest scandal is when Mrs. Henderson's cat got into the church during Sunday service and knocked over the collection basket. I laughed despite myself. That sounds oddly specific. Because it happened last week. Mittens is a local celebrity now. There's talk of giving him his own social media account. Tommy appeared with 2 cups that actually smelled like coffee instead of burnt rubber. Rachel pushed one toward me. Try this. If you still hate it, I'll personally escort you to the gas station where they have one of those fancy machines. The coffee was actually decent. More than decent, it was good. Rich without being bitter, smooth without being weak. I looked up at her, surprised. Better? Much. How did he go from liquid punishment to actually drinkable coffee? Trade. Secret. Tommy's got about 6 different brewing methods, but he only uses the good ones for people he likes. The terrible stuff is reserved for tourists and anyone who complains about the Wi-Fi. And how do I know which category I'm in? She grinned. Well, you're drinking the good coffee, so I'd say you're off the tourist list. Congratulations, you're now officially a potential local. We talked for another hour. She told me about her art studio downtown, how she'd moved here 3 years ago from Denver, after what she vaguely described as a life reorganization, I told her about my complete lack of handyman skills and how Marcus was patiently teaching me the difference between a chisel and a cheese grater, which apparently was a more important distinction than I'd initially thought. "You should come by the shop sometime," I said as we both prepared to leave. "Marcus loves showing off his work, and I promise not to accidentally sand anyone's family heirlooms." "I might take you up on that." She paused at the door, that amused smile returning. "Fair warning, though, I have a tendency to collect strays. Broken furniture, lost causes, people who drink terrible coffee without complaining. You seem like you might fit at least 2 of those categories. Is that good or bad? Depends on how you feel about adventure." Before I could ask what she meant by that, she was gone, walking down Main Street with a slight bounce in her step that suggested she knew exactly what kind of chaos she'd just set in motion. I should have known that adventure in Rachel's vocabulary meant something completely different from what normal people considered adventure. Normal people might think adventure meant trying a new restaurant or taking a different route to work. Rachel's version apparently involved showing up at Marcus's shop 3 days later with a truck full of what she generously called vintage furniture with potential, and what Marcus less generously called firewood that hasn't given up yet. Marcus emerged from the back room wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. He was 60-something, built like a tree stump, and had the kind of patience that came from 40 years of coaxing life back into things other people had given up on. He looked at the truck, then at Rachel, then at me with an expression that suggested this was somehow my fault. "Friend of yours?" he asked. "We met at the cafe," I said, which wasn't really an answer but was all I had. Rachel bounded over, like an enthusiastic golden retriever. "You must be Marcus. Justin's told me so much about you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Has he now? Marcus's tone suggested he doubted this was entirely positive. "I have a proposition," she continued, undeterred by his obvious skepticism. "I've got a studio full of furniture that people have abandoned. Estate sales, garage sales, the occasional roadside rescue mission. Most of it just needs someone who knows what they're doing to bring it back to life." Marcus walked over to the truck and peered inside. I followed, curious despite myself. The truck bed was packed with chairs missing legs, tables with more character than structural integrity, and what appeared to be a dresser that had been used as target practice. "This one's been shot," Marcus observed, pointing at the dresser. "BB gun," Rachel said cheerfully. "Previous owner's grandson thought it would be fun. The holes give it personality. The holes give it tetanus." But I could see him evaluating each piece, his experienced eye seeing past the damage to whatever potential lay underneath. Marcus had this way of looking at broken things like they were puzzles waiting to be solved, rather than problems to be discarded. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. "Partnership. I find the pieces, you and Justin restore them. I sell them through the studio. Split the profits 3 ways. She paused, then added, "Plus, it would give Justin here some real projects to work on instead of just watching you do all the actual work." I started to protest, but she wasn't wrong. Most of my time at the shop involved Marcus, patiently explaining why I was holding tools incorrectly while he did the actual restoration work. I was learning, but slowly, and Marcus was too polite to point out that I was probably costing him more in wasted materials than I was worth in labor. "I don't know," Marcus said, but I could tell he was intrigued. "Some of this stuff is pretty far gone." "So was I when I got here," Rachel said with that disarming honesty that seemed to be her default setting. "Sometimes things just need someone to believe they're worth saving." Marcus looked at me. "What do you think?" Honestly, I thought it sounded terrifying. I'd barely mastered basic sanding techniques, and now she wanted me to help restore furniture that looked like it had survived both a natural disaster and a small war. But there was something about Rachel's enthusiasm that was infectious, and something about the challenge that appealed to the part of me that had been sleepwalking through life for the past few years. "I think I'd like to try," I said. And that's how I found myself 2 hours later, carefully removing what appeared to be several layers of paint from a wooden chair, while Rachel perched on a stool, sketching and providing running commentary. "That chair is from the 1940s, she said, not looking up from her drawing. "Solid oak underneath all that paint. Someone covered it in about 6 different colors over the years. It's like archaeological layers of bad decorating decisions. How do you know all this? I asked, pausing to wipe sweat from my forehead. Paint removal was harder work than it looked. I've been collecting broken things for a while. You start to recognize quality construction even when it's buried under decades of neglect. She looked up from her sketch. People do the same thing, you know. Cover up their original beauty with layers of whatever they think will make them more acceptable. I wasn't sure if she was still talking about furniture, or if this had become a metaphor, but before I could ask, Marcus called out from across the shop. "Rachel, come look at this desk. Tell me what you see." She hopped off the stool and walked over to where Marcus was examining a roll-top desk that had seen better decades. I followed, curious about what had caught his attention. "It's gorgeous. Under all this damage," she said immediately. "The wood grain is beautiful, and the mechanism still works." She demonstrated by rolling the top up and down. "What's the catch?" "No catch. It's a good piece, but it's going to take time. Weeks, maybe a month of careful work." He looked at both of us. "You sure you want to commit to something like that?" Rachel grinned. "Marcus, I once spent 6 months nursing a cactus back to health. I think I can handle a commitment to a desk." "Cacti are supposed to be low maintenance," I pointed out. "Not when you accidentally water them every day for 2 weeks because you forget they're not regular plants." She shrugged. "But it survived, and now it's the happiest, most overwatered cactus in Colorado. Sometimes good intentions and stubborn persistence are enough." Marcus chuckled, and I realized it was the first time I'd heard him laugh since I'd started working there. "All right then, we'll try it. But I'm warning you both, this isn't going to be a quick flip situation. Real restoration takes patience." "Good thing Patience is my middle name," Rachel said. "I thought Adventure was your middle name," I said. "I have several middle names. It's complicated." As we spent the rest of the afternoon sorting through her collection and planning our approach to each piece, I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in months. There was something satisfying about working with my hands, about taking something broken and imagining it whole again. Rachel had this way of seeing potential in everything, pointing out details I would have missed and telling stories about where each piece might have come from. This table probably hosted 1,000 family dinners, she said, running her hand over a scarred wooden surface. "Look at these ring stains. Every one of them is a story. Birthday parties, holiday meals, homework sessions. We're not just restoring furniture, we're preserving memories." By the time we called it a day, my hands were stained with paint remover, and my back ached from hunching over various pieces, but I felt more energized than I had in years. As we locked up the shop, Rachel turned to me with that mischievous smile I was starting to recognize as a warning sign. "So, what are you doing?" "Saturday?" she asked. "Probably recovering from today," I said honestly. "Perfect. I know where we can find more pieces. There's an estate sale about an hour outside town. The listing mentions a barn full of furniture that hasn't been touched in decades." I looked at her suspiciously. "What kind of barn? And please tell me it doesn't involve any livestock." "No livestock. Just the possibility of treasure hunting in a building that may or may not be structurally sound." "That's not as reassuring as you think it is. Come on, Justin. Where's your sense of adventure?" And despite every rational voice in my head telling me that following Rachel into a potentially unstable barn was probably not the best decision I could make, I heard myself saying, "What time should I pick you up?" Her grin was triumphant. 8 a.m., and bring work gloves, and maybe a tetanus shot." As I drove home that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that my quiet life in Millbrook was about to become significantly less quiet. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, that prospect didn't terrify me. It actually sounded like exactly what I needed. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel possible. I pulled up to Rachel's address at exactly 8 a.m., expecting to wait while she gathered whatever supplies one brings to potentially dangerous barn exploration. Instead, she was already sitting on her front porch with a thermos of coffee and a backpack that looked like it had survived several archaeological expeditions. "Punctual," she said, climbing into my truck. "I like that in a treasure hunting partner." Her house, I noticed for the first time, was a small craftsman bungalow painted sage green with flower boxes that somehow managed to look deliberately wild rather than neglected. Wind chimes made from what appeared to be old silverware hung from the porch, creating a gentle melody that followed us as we drove away. "So, tell me about this barn," I said as we headed out of town. "Please tell me you've actually seen it and it's not just a rumor you heard from someone's cousin's neighbor." "I drove out there yesterday to scope it out," she said, pouring coffee from her thermos into a travel mug and handing it to me. "The estate belongs to a woman named Eleanor Hartley. She's 93 and moving to assisted living. Her family is selling everything because apparently none of them want to deal with 60 years of accumulated belongings." The coffee was perfect, smooth and rich, with a hint of cinnamon. "You made this?" "Don't sound so surprised. I have many hidden talents," she grinned. "Eleanor's husband was a furniture maker, built pieces for half the county back in the day. According to the estate sale listing, there's a whole workshop's worth of his work that's been sitting untouched since he died 15 years ago. We drove through rolling hills dotted with farms, and the occasional house that looked like it had been there since before anyone thought to plan where houses should go." Rachel provided running commentary on the landscape, pointing out interesting barns, speculating about the lives of people in houses we passed, and somehow making a 40-minute drive feel like 10. "There," she said as we crested a hill, "the white farmhouse with the red barn." The property spread across several acres, with the main house sitting close to the road and various outbuildings scattered behind it like afterthoughts. Cars were already parked along the gravel driveway, and I could see people wandering between tables set up on the lawn, examining dishes and books, and the accumulated detritus of a long life. But Rachel's attention was fixed on the barn, a massive red structure that looked like it had been built to last centuries. "That's where the good stuff is," she said, with the kind of reverence most people reserved for churches or museums. We parked and made our way past the main sale area. A woman with silver hair and kind eyes, who I assumed was Eleanor Hartley, sat in a folding chair near the house, watching people sort through her belongings with a mixture of sadness and relief. "Mrs. Hartley?" Rachel approached her with that natural warmth that made strangers feel like old friends. "I'm Rachel. We spoke on the phone about the workshop pieces." Eleanor's face brightened. "Oh yes, dear. You're the one who sounded like you might actually appreciate Harold's work." She struggled to stand, and I instinctively moved to help her. "Most of these people just want to know if things are worth anything. You wanted to know about the stories." "Every piece has a story," Rachel said simply. "I'd love to hear some of them." Eleanor led us toward the barn, moving slowly but with obvious determination. "Harold built that workshop when we were first married. Spent 40 years making furniture for people who appreciated quality craftsmanship. When someone wanted a dining table, they came to Harold. Wedding gifts, nursery, furniture, hope chests for young brides. He built things that were meant to last generations." She paused at the barn door, her hand resting on the weathered wood. "I haven't been in here since we had to move his tools out to make room for hay storage. But his finished pieces, the ones nobody ever claimed, or the ones he made just because he loved the wood, they're all still in there." The barn door creaked open to reveal a space that felt more like a cathedral than a storage building. Afternoon light streamed through high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air, like tiny spirits. And everywhere, covered in tarps and old sheets, were shapes that suggested furniture waiting to be discovered. Rachel moved through the space like an art critic in a gallery, carefully lifting covers and revealing treasures underneath. A dining table made from walnut that gleamed even under decades of dust. Chairs with seats that needed recaning but frames that were perfect. A rocking chair that looked like it had been carved by someone who understood exactly how bodies wanted to rest. "This is incredible," I breathed, running my hand along the surface of a desk that seemed to have been made from a single piece of oak. "Harold always said furniture should be made to outlast the people who owned it," Eleanor said from the doorway. "He wanted to create things that would become family heirlooms, pieces that would carry memories from one generation to the next." Rachel was crouched next to a large piece covered by a canvas tarp. She looked up at Eleanor questioningly, and the older woman nodded. When Rachel pulled away the covering, we all stood in silence. It was a bedroom set, clearly made as a matching collection. The headboard was carved with intricate details that caught the light, and the accompanying dresser and vanity showed the same attention to craftsmanship. But what made it extraordinary wasn't just the quality of the work. It was the obvious love that had gone into every detail. "He made that for our daughter," Eleanor said quietly. "She died in a car accident when she was 17, 2 weeks before her high school graduation. Harold had been working on it for months, planning to give it to her when she went to college." Her voice caught slightly. "I couldn't bear to see it after that, so we covered it up and never spoke of it again." The barn fell silent, except for the distant sounds of the estate sale continuing outside. I felt like an intruder in this moment of grief that had been waiting 60 years to be acknowledged. Rachel stood slowly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's beautiful," she said simply. "She would have loved it." Eleanor wiped her eyes with a tissue she pulled from her pocket. "I always hoped someday I'd find the right person to have it. Someone who would understand what it meant, who would give it the kind of home Harold intended." "We'll take good care of it," Rachel said without hesitation, then looked at me with an expression that suggested this wasn't really a negotiation. "All of it. Everything in here deserves to be loved. Again." The next 2 hours were spent cataloging pieces, discussing prices that seemed almost insultingly low for the quality of work we were seeing, and arranging for a truck to move everything to Marcus's shop. Eleanor insisted on giving us Harold's tools as well, saying they belonged with someone who would use them properly rather than letting them rust in someone else's garage. As we loaded the last of the smaller pieces into my truck, Eleanor pulled Rachel aside. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw the older woman press something into Rachel's hand and give her the kind of hug that suggested a benediction. "What was that about?" I asked as we drove away. Rachel was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the countryside rolling past. Finally, she opened her hand to reveal an old brass key. She said Harold always locked his workshop when he was working on something special. This was the key to the room where he kept the pieces that meant the most to him. She turned the key over in her palm. She said she thought I might understand what it feels like to lose something before you're ready to let it go. I wanted to ask what she meant by that, but something in her expression suggested this wasn't the right time for questions. Instead, I reached over and squeezed her hand briefly. "I think we just witnessed something pretty special back there." "Yeah," she said softly. "We did." When we arrived back at the shop, Marcus was waiting with a truck he'd borrowed, and 2 of his friends who apparently specialized in moving heavy furniture without breaking it or themselves. The next few hours were spent carefully transporting Harold's life work to its new temporary home. As evening fell and the last piece was safely inside, the 3 of us stood in the shop surrounded by more beautiful furniture than I'd ever seen in one place. Rachel moved from piece to piece like she was greeting old friends, running her hands over surfaces and examining joinery with an appreciation that went beyond mere admiration. "This is going to take months," Marcus said, but he sounded more excited than daunted. "Maybe longer. Some of these pieces just need cleaning and minor repairs, but others are going to require complete restoration." "Good," Rachel said firmly. "They've waited this long. They deserve to be done right." I found myself standing next to the bedroom set we'd uncovered first, the one Harold had made for his daughter. Up close, I could see details I'd missed in the barn. Tiny flowers carved into the corners of the headboard, delicate scrollwork on the drawer pulls, the kind of details that spoke of a father's love for a child who would never get to use the gift he was creating. "You okay?" Rachel appeared beside me, following my gaze to the furniture. "Just thinking about how much love went into this," I said, "and how sad it is that it never served its purpose." "Maybe it did serve its purpose," she said thoughtfully. "Maybe the purpose was the making of it, not the using. Harold got to spend months imagining his daughter's happiness, planning for her future, creating something beautiful because he loved her. Sometimes the act of love matters more than whether it gets received the way we intended." I looked at her, struck by the wisdom in that observation, and wondering what personal experience had taught her to think that way. But before I could form the question, she was already moving toward the next piece, and the moment passed. As we locked up the shop that night, I realized that something had shifted during the day. What had started as a partnership of convenience was beginning to feel like something more substantial. Rachel had a way of seeing beauty in broken things and meaning in abandoned dreams that made me want to see the world through her eyes. Same time next week? She asked as we reached our cars. For what? More treasure hunting. There are 3 more estate sales next weekend. And I have a feeling we're just getting started. I should have said no. I should have suggested we focus on the mountain of work we'd just committed to before adding more projects to the pile. But something about the way she smiled when she talked about finding forgotten treasures made me want to follow her wherever she was planning to go next. Same time next week, I agreed. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was falling into something I didn't quite understand yet. Rachel had this way of turning ordinary days into adventures and making the act of restoration feel like resurrection. For someone who had spent years feeling disconnected from any sense of purpose, it was both thrilling and terrifying. But as I thought about Harold's furniture waiting in the shop, about Eleanor's gratitude, and about Rachel's passionate belief that broken things deserved second chances, I realized I was more excited about Monday morning than I'd been about anything in longer than I could remember. Whatever this was turning into, I was ready to see where it led. 3 weeks into what Rachel cheerfully called Operation Furniture Resurrection, I learned that working closely with someone reveals things about them that casual conversation never could. Rachel hummed while she worked, always different songs that seemed to match whatever piece she was restoring. She had strong opinions about wood-stained colors, and an almost supernatural ability to know exactly which vintage hardware would complement a particular piece. She also had a habit of talking to the furniture like it could hear her, offering encouragement during difficult repairs and apologizing when she had to remove particularly stubborn damage. "Sorry, old friend," she murmured to a cabinet as she carefully sanded away decades of paint buildup. "I know this isn't comfortable, but you'll feel so much better when we're done." Marcus had initially been skeptical of her methods, but even he had to admit that Rachel seemed to coax life back into pieces that should have been beyond saving. She had infinite patience for delicate work, and an eye for color that turned simple staining jobs into works of art. Which is why I was completely unprepared for the day everything went sideways. It started with the town's Harvest Festival, an annual celebration that apparently turned quiet Millbrook into a temporary carnival complete with food trucks, live music, and enough craft booths to supply a small country with hand-knitted scarves. Rachel had insisted we set up a booth to display some of our finished pieces, claiming it would be good exposure for our growing business. "Besides," she'd said while helping me load Harold's restored rocking chair into the truck, "people need to see what we're doing here. Every piece we save is a piece of history that doesn't end up in a landfill." The morning of the festival was perfect, crisp and clear, with the kind of golden light that made everything look like a postcard. We'd arrived early to set up our booth, which Rachel had decorated with fairy lights and small potted plants that somehow made the furniture look like it was posing for a magazine shoot. By noon, we'd drawn a steady crowd of admirers, and had actually sold 2 pieces to a couple from the next town over who spent 20 minutes hearing Rachel tell the story of a refinished dining table like it was the most fascinating thing they'd ever encountered. I was starting to think the day couldn't get any better when Rachel suddenly went very still beside me. "Problem?" I asked, following her gaze across the festival grounds. A man was walking toward our booth with the determined stride of someone on a mission. He was probably in his early 50s, well-dressed in that casual but expensive way that suggested success, and he was staring directly at Rachel with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That's my ex-husband," Rachel said quietly, and suddenly her entire demeanor changed. The easy confidence that normally radiated from her seemed to fold in on itself, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. The man reached our booth and stopped, his eyes moving from Rachel to me to the furniture display and back to Rachel. "Hello, Rach." "Michael." Her voice was carefully neutral. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you, actually. Took me a while to track you down." He gestured around the festival. "This is quite a change from Denver." I felt like I was watching a conversation through bulletproof glass, able to see everything but unable to hear the subtext that was clearly flowing between them. Rachel's shoulders had tensed, and she was gripping the edge of our display table hard enough that her knuckles were white. "I like it here," she said simply. "Playing with old furniture suits you," Michael said, and something in his tone suggested this wasn't entirely a compliment. "Very quaint, very you." That's when I stepped forward, extending my hand with probably more enthusiasm than the situation warranted. "I'm Justin. Rachel and I are business partners. Michael shook my hand, with the kind of grip that felt like a test. Michael Winters, I'm Rachel's husband. Ex-husband, Rachel corrected quickly. Right, ex-husband. His smile didn't reach his eyes. We need to talk, Rach, about the papers. Rachel's face went pale. I thought we settled everything. Most things. But there are some loose ends we need to address. The house, for one thing. I didn't understand what was happening. But I could see that Rachel was struggling, and every protective instinct I had was suddenly activated. Maybe this isn't the best place for this conversation, I suggested. Michael looked at me like he'd forgotten I was there. You're right. This is between me and my wife. Ex-wife, I said firmly. Right. He turned back to Rachel. I'm staying at the bed and breakfast on Elm Street, room 7. We really do need to talk. After he left, Rachel stood motionless for several long minutes, staring at the spot where he'd been standing like she was trying to make sense of what had just happened. You okay? I asked gently. She shook her head slowly. No, not really. She looked around the festival, at the families enjoying the perfect autumn day, at our carefully arranged booth full of rescued furniture. I need to get out of here. We packed up quickly, Rachel working with mechanical efficiency while I handled the logistics. She didn't speak during the drive back to the shop, just stared out the window with an expression I'd never seen before, like she was watching her. Life rearrange itself in ways she couldn't control. Once we'd unloaded everything, she sat heavily on one of the stools in Marcus's workshop and put her head in her hands. I'm sorry you had to see that. You don't have anything to apologize for. I pulled up another stool beside her. Want to talk about it? She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. Then, without looking up, she started talking. Michael and I were married for 8 years. He's a real estate developer, very successful, very focused on success in general. I was working as a graphic designer for his company when we met. He was charming, ambitious, everything I thought I wanted. She finally raised her head, and I could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. For a while, it was good. We had this beautiful house in Denver, all the right friends, the kind of life that looks perfect from the outside. But somewhere along the way, I started feeling like I was disappearing, like I was becoming this person he wanted me to be instead of who I actually was. I wanted to say something comforting, but I could tell she needed to get this out, so I just listened. The breaking point came 2 years ago. We were trying to have kids, had been for a couple of years. When it wasn't happening, we went through all the tests, all the procedures. Turns out the problem was mine. I couldn't get pregnant. Her voice caught slightly. Michael said he was okay with it, that we could adopt or just be happy with each other. But I could see the disappointment in his eyes every time he looked at me, like I'd broken some fundamental promise. Rachel, that's not your fault. I know that. Intellectually, I know that. But when someone you love starts looking at you like you're defective, it's hard not to internalize that feeling. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. So, I started acting out, making impulsive decisions, bringing home stray animals, taking art classes instead of focusing on work. I think I was trying to prove I was still interesting, still worth loving, even if I couldn't give him the family he wanted. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Rachel's passionate defense of broken things, her belief that everything deserved a second chance, her tendency to collect strays and lost causes. The final fight was about a dog, she continued. I'd found this old golden retriever at the shelter, probably 12 years old, missing one eye, completely gray around the muzzle. The shelter was going to put him down because nobody wanted an elderly dog with health problems, so I adopted him without asking Michael first. She smiled sadly at the memory. Buster was the sweetest dog you've ever seen. Just wanted to sleep in sunny spots and have someone scratch behind his ears. But Michael lost it. Said I was being irresponsible, that we couldn't afford the vet bills for an old sick dog, that I was making decisions based on emotion instead of logic. What happened? I told him Buster was staying. Michael said if the dog stayed, he was leaving. So I chose the dog. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Marriage over because I couldn't bear to let an old dog die alone. Michael said it proved I wasn't ready to make mature decisions about family. And now he's here. Now he's here, probably with papers I need to sign or some legal loose end that gives him an excuse to remind me that I chose chaos over stability. She stood up and walked over to the bedroom set we'd rescued from Harold's barn. You know what the really sad part is? I don't regret it. Buster lived with me for 8 more months before his heart gave out, and they were 8 months of pure contentment for him. I got to give him love and comfort at the end of his life, and he gave me the courage to leave a marriage that was slowly suffocating me. I joined her beside the carved headboard, both of us quiet for a moment. What did you do after? Packed everything I could fit in my car, left the house and the life and most of my possessions, and drove until I found a place that felt like home. Millbrook was the first place I stopped where people looked at me like I might belong, instead of like I was just passing through. And the art studio? Insurance settlement from a car accident that wasn't my fault. Michael tried to claim half of it in the divorce, said it was marital property even though the accident happened after I'd moved out. That's probably what he wants to discuss. She ran her hand along the smooth wood of the dresser. He never understood why I wanted to save broken things. Said it was a waste of time and money to rescue furniture people had thrown away. Something about the way she said it made me angry on her behalf. He was wrong. Was he? Look at this place. She gestured around the workshop filled with projects in various stages of completion. I've got a business built on rescuing things other people have given up on. I'm 38 years old, living alone in a small town, turning down every normal relationship opportunity because I'm too scared to trust anyone not to leave when I inevitably disappoint them. The conversation had taken a turn I wasn't prepared for, and I found myself in the dangerous territory of wanting to fix something that wasn't really my problem to fix. But looking at Rachel standing next to furniture that represented hope and renewal, talking about herself like she was one of the broken pieces that couldn't be saved, I couldn't stay quiet. You're not broken, I said firmly. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. You see beauty where other people see garbage. You have more compassion in your little finger than most people have in their entire bodies. And anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve you. She turned to look at me, and for a moment the air between us felt charged with something I wasn't quite ready to name. Then her phone buzzed with a text message, breaking the spell. It's him, she said after, glancing at the screen. He wants to meet for dinner tomorrow to discuss the house situation. She looked up at me with an expression that was half hope, half terror. Will you come with me? I know it's a lot to ask, but I don't think I can face him alone. I didn't even hesitate. Of course. As we locked up the shop and went our separate ways for the evening, I realized that somewhere in the past few weeks, Rachel had stopped being just a business partner, or even just a friend. I cared about her in a way that went beyond professional collaboration or casual affection. She mattered to me, and seeing her hurt made me want to protect her from anything that might cause her more pain. Which is probably why I spent most of that night lying awake, wondering what exactly I was getting myself into, and whether I was prepared for whatever complications tomorrow might bring. The restaurant Michael had chosen was the kind of upscale place that had appeared in Millbrook about 6 months ago, clearly targeting the weekend crowd from the city who came out for authentic small-town charm, but still wanted craft cocktails and artisanal everything. It felt like enemy territory for what should have been Rachel's conversation, and I suspected that was intentional. Rachel had been quiet during the drive over, fidgeting with the sleeves of her sweater and checking her appearance in the passenger side mirror more times than I'd ever seen her worry about how she looked. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, I could tell, something that struck a balance between looking put together and not trying too hard. The result was that she looked beautiful, but in a way that seemed designed to armor her against whatever was coming. You sure you want me to come in? I asked as we sat in the parking lot. I could wait out here. No. Her voice was firm. I need you there. Michael has this way of making me doubt myself, of twisting conversations until I'm not sure what I actually think anymore. Having you there will help me stay grounded. Michael was already seated at a corner table when we walked in, and I could see him taking inventory of Rachel's appearance and mine with the calculating look of someone accustomed to reading people for advantage. He stood when we approached, kissing Rachel's cheek in a gesture that seemed more possessive than affectionate. You look good, Rach, he said, holding her chair for her. Small-town life agrees with you. Thank you, she replied carefully, settling into her seat while I took the chair across from her. Michael had ordered wine without waiting for us, something expensive that he made a show of having the server taste and approve. It was a performance designed to establish his sophistication and, by extension, highlight what Rachel had given up when she left. "So," he said once we'd placed our orders, "I have to say, I'm impressed with what you've built here. The furniture restoration business is charming." There it was again. That word. Charming. The way he said it made it sound diminutive, like a hobby rather than a real endeavor. "It's doing well," Rachel said evenly. "We have more work than we can handle." "That's wonderful. Really." He turned to me with what I was beginning to recognize as his professional smile. "And Justin, Rachel tells me you used to work in Chicago? Marketing, was it?" "Digital marketing," I confirmed, before I burned out and decided I needed to do something with my hands instead of my laptop. "I understand completely. There's something appealing about physical work, isn't there? Very therapeutic." His tone suggested he viewed my career change as a temporary sabbatical rather than a permanent shift. Though I imagine the income potential is quite different. Rachel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but before she could respond, Michael was already moving to his main agenda. "Which brings me to why I'm here," he said, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "The house sold last month, finally. The market in Denver has been incredible, and we got 30% above asking price." Rachel blinked. "You sold the house? Without telling me?" "I tried calling several times. Your number seems to have changed." He slid a check across the table toward her. "Your half of the proceeds, minus the realtor fees and the cost of the repairs we discussed." Rachel stared at the check without touching it. "What repairs?" "The roof needed work, and we had to replace the heating system. Plus, I updated the kitchen to appeal to buyers. Standard stuff." He waved dismissively. "It all worked out beautifully. The new owners are a young family with twins. They love what we created there." I watched Rachel's face as she processed this information. The house they'd shared, the life they'd built together, had been packaged and sold to strangers without her input, or even her knowledge. Michael was presenting it as a business transaction, clean and efficient. But I could see the emotional impact hitting her like a physical blow. "You didn't have the right to make those decisions without consulting me," she said quietly. "Technically, the divorce decree gave me power of attorney to handle the sale since you'd abandoned the property." His voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a slow child. "I was protecting both our interests." "Abandoned?" Rachel's voice rose slightly. "I left because staying was killing me. That's not abandonment. That's survival." "If you say so?" Michael's expression suggested he disagreed but wasn't going to argue the point. "The important thing is that it's done now, and you're free to move on completely." That's when he dropped the real bombshell. "Actually, speaking of moving on, there's something else I wanted to tell you. Sarah and I are engaged." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel went very still, her face cycling through several emotions before settling on a carefully controlled blankness that was somehow more alarming than if she'd started screaming. "Sarah," she repeated. "From the office. You remember her." Michael's tone was casual, like he was mentioning the weather. "We started spending time together after you left. And well, one thing led to another. The wedding is next spring." I wanted to reach across the table and punch him. Not because I had any particular attachment to Rachel's past relationship, but because of the casual cruelty with which he was delivering information clearly designed to hurt her. This wasn't necessary business communication. This was emotional warfare disguised as polite conversation. "Congratulations," Rachel managed. "I hope you're very happy together." "Thank you, we are." He smiled with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Sarah's pregnant, actually, due in May. We're thrilled." And there it was, the thing he'd really come here to say. Michael hadn't driven to Millbrook to handle business details or tie up loose ends. He'd come to make sure Rachel understood that. He'd found someone who could give him everything she couldn't. Someone who could get pregnant, who made better choices, who was ready for the kind of mature family life Rachel had supposedly been too selfish and unstable to provide. Rachel's hand was trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass, and I could see her struggling to maintain her composure. That's wonderful news, she said, her voice steady despite the obvious effort it was costing her. Children are a blessing. They are. Michael leaned back in his chair, satisfied that his message had been delivered and received. Sarah's already planning the nursery. She has excellent taste. Very practical, but warm. Nothing like that chaotic style you preferred. That did it. I couldn't sit there and watch him systematically dismantle Rachel's sense of self-worth under the guise of friendly conversation any longer. I think Rachel's style is incredible, I said, my voice carrying more edge than I'd intended. She has an eye for beauty that most people completely miss. She can see potential in things other people have written off as worthless and turn them into something amazing. Michael looked at me with mild surprise, as if he'd forgotten I was capable of speech. Of course. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. Actually, that's exactly what you meant to suggest. I leaned forward slightly. You've spent this entire conversation trying to make Rachel feel like her choices are inferior to yours. Like her life here is somehow less valid than the life you've built. But from where I'm sitting, you're the one who seems to be missing something important. Justin, Rachel said quietly, but I was beyond caring about diplomatic restraint. Rachel has built something beautiful here, I continued. She's created a business that brings joy to people, that saves pieces of history from being thrown away, that gives new life to things everyone else has given up on. She's kind, talented, passionate about what she does, and one of the strongest people I've ever met. If you can't see that, then you're the one who lost something valuable, not her. The restaurant had gone quiet around our table, and I realized I'd been speaking louder than I'd intended. Michael was staring at me with a mixture of surprise and calculation, while Rachel looked like she wasn't sure whether to be grateful or mortified. Well, Michael said after a long moment, it seems Rachel has found herself quite a champion. She doesn't need a champion, I replied. She's perfectly capable of standing up for herself. I just couldn't sit here and watch you try to make her feel small. Michael turned to Rachel with raised eyebrows. Is this how you want to handle this conversation? Rachel took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been all evening. Justin's right. You didn't come here to handle business. You came here to make sure I knew that you'd replaced me with someone better, someone who could give you what I couldn't. She picked up the check and tucked it into her purse without looking at the amount. Well, message received. You found someone who fits your vision of the perfect wife and mother. Good for you. She stood up, and I quickly followed suit. But here's what you don't understand, Michael. I'm not broken because I couldn't get pregnant. I'm not a failure because I chose to save a dying dog over preserving a marriage that was making me miserable. And I'm not settling for less by building a life here with people who actually value who I am, instead of who they want me to become. Michael started to respond, but Rachel held up her hand. I hope you and Sarah are very happy together. I hope your baby is healthy and that you build the kind of family you've always wanted. But I'm done letting you make me feel like I'm somehow deficient because I wanted different things than you did. We left him sitting at the table with his expensive wine and his satisfied expression, walking out into the cool evening air that felt like freedom after the suffocating atmosphere of that restaurant. Rachel was quiet until we reached the truck, then she turned to me with tears in her eyes. Thank you, she said simply. You didn't need me to defend you in there. No, but it meant everything that you wanted to. She wiped her eyes and smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all day. I forgot what it felt like to have someone see my worth without needing me to prove it first. As we drove back toward town, I found myself thinking about Michael's casual cruelty and Rachel's dignified response. She'd been right when she said she wasn't broken. If anything, watching her handle that conversation with grace and strength had only reinforced what I'd been slowly realizing over the past few weeks. I was falling in love with her. Not with some idealized version of who she might become, but with exactly who she was right now. Her passion for saving discarded things, her belief in second chances, her ability to find beauty in the broken and forgotten, the way she hummed while she worked and talked to furniture like it had feelings, her courage in choosing authenticity over acceptance, even when it cost her everything she'd thought she wanted. But sitting in that restaurant, listening to Michael deliver his carefully crafted emotional demolition, I'd also realized something else. Rachel was still healing from the damage her marriage had done. still learning to trust her own judgment again. The last thing she needed was another man trying to reshape her life around his needs and expectations, which meant that no matter how I felt about her, I was going to have to be very careful about how and when I told her. Because Rachel deserved someone who loved her exactly as she was, not someone who saw her as a project to be fixed or a prize to be won. The question was whether I could be that person, and whether she would ever be ready to trust someone with her heart again. The weeks following Michael's visit fell into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and fragile, like we were both being extra careful not to disturb something delicate that was growing between us. Rachel threw herself into the restoration work with renewed focus, spending long hours perfecting details that most people would never notice. I found myself staying later at the shop, not because the work required it, but because being around her had become the best part of my day. We'd finished Harold's bedroom set, and it was stunning. The carved headboard gleamed with a warm honey finish that brought out every detail of the intricate flowers. Rachel had insisted on using period-appropriate hardware, spending hours researching the exact style of drawer pulls that would have been original to the piece. When we finally moved it to the showroom area of her studio, people stopped on the sidewalk to stare through the window. That's where we were, arranging the bedroom set under the afternoon light streaming through her studio windows, when Rachel asked the question that changed everything. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said, adjusting the angle of the vanity mirror for the third time. "Shoot. How old do you think I am?" I paused in my polishing of the dresser handles, caught off guard by the randomness of the question. "I don't know. Does it matter?" "Humor me." I studied her face, really looked at her for the first time with the specific goal of guessing her age. She had laugh lines around her eyes, and a few silver threads woven through her dark hair that caught the light when she moved. Her hands showed the wear of someone who worked with them, but her energy and enthusiasm made her seem ageless. 35? I guessed, picking a number that felt safe. She laughed, the sound bright and genuine. "I'm 49, Justin. Does that change everything?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't sure either of us was ready to examine. 49. She was 14 years older than me. Old enough that when I was learning to drive, she was already married to Michael. Old enough that we'd grown up in different decades, shaped by different cultural touchstones and life experiences. Why would it change anything? I asked carefully. Because most men your age want someone they can build a future with. Marriage, kids, the whole traditional timeline. She turned away from me, focusing intently on rearranging items on the vanity. I'm past all that. Even if I could still have children, which I can't, I wouldn't want to start over with diapers and sleepless nights at this stage of my life. Rachel. I'm not fishing for reassurance, she continued, not looking at me. I'm just being honest about what I have to offer. I come with a lot of history, some of it messy. I'm set in my ways. I talk to furniture and rescue dying plants and make impulsive decisions that practical people would never make. Rachel, stop. She finally turned to face me, and I could see the vulnerability she'd been trying to hide. I like you, Justin. More than I should, probably. But I won't be the older woman who tricks some younger guy into thinking he wants something he'll regret later. The conversation we'd been dancing around for weeks was finally happening, and I realized I had a choice to make. I could play it safe, keep things professional, pretend that working closely with her every day hadn't made me fall completely and irrevocably in love with her. Or I could tell her the truth and risk everything we'd built together. You want to know what I think about when I look at you? I said, setting down my polishing cloth and moving closer to her. I think about how you see beauty in things other people have given up on. I think about the way you hummed while you worked on that cabinet last week, how you knew exactly which stain would bring out the grain in the wood. I think about how you made Eleanor Hartley cry happy tears when we picked up Harold's furniture, how you gave that old woman hope that his work would be loved again. Rachel was very still, watching my face like she was trying to read something written there. I think about how you stood up to Michael without losing your grace, how you protected yourself without becoming bitter. I reached out and touched her hand gently. I think about how every day I get to spend working beside you, Feels like a gift, and how the idea of doing this without you makes everything seem gray and pointless. Justin, you don't understand what you're saying. I understand perfectly. I took both of her hands in mine. I'm saying I love you. Not some younger version of you. Not who you might have been 15 years ago. I love you exactly as you are right now. 49 years old, talking to furniture, rescuing broken things, making me laugh every single day. She pulled her hands free and stepped back, shaking her head. You think you do. But love changes when reality sets in. When you realize I'll be 60 when you're 45. When your friends start making comments about robbing the cradle in reverse. When you meet someone your own age who wants the same things you want. What things? What exactly do you think? I want that you can't give me? A family, children, a future that makes sense. Rachel, I've had relationships with women my own age. I've dated people who wanted all those traditional things, who had their lives mapped out in 5-year plans. And you know what? I was miserable. I felt like I was playing a role in someone else's idea of what my life should look like. I gestured, around her studio, at the furniture we'd restored together, at the life she'd built from nothing after losing everything. This is the most real I've ever felt. Working with you, building something meaningful together, being with someone who chooses joy over security and authenticity over acceptance. If that's not a future worth wanting, then I don't know what is. Tears were threatening at the corners of her eyes, and I could see her struggling with something internal. What if you change your mind? What if 5 years from now you wake up and realize you've wasted the best years of your life with someone who's already lived most of hers? Then I'll have spent 5 years with the woman I love, doing work that matters, in a place that feels like home. How is that wasted? She was quiet for a long moment, and I held my breath, waiting for her response. Finally, she looked up at me with the expression that was half hope, half terror. I'm scared, she whispered. Of what? Of believing you. Of letting myself want this, and then losing it again when you realize what everyone else will see when they look at us. I moved closer to her, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. Rachel, I'm 35 years old. I've been married to my job, dated women I had nothing in common with, and spent most of my adult life feeling like I was sleepwalking through someone else's idea of success. Meeting you woke me up. You made me remember what it feels like to be excited about tomorrow. She reached up and touched my face gently, like she was memorizing the moment. You really don't care that I'm 14 years older than you? I care that you think it matters when it doesn't. I care that someone made you believe your age makes you less valuable when it actually makes you more interesting. I care that you're scared to trust your own happiness because someone else convinced you that you don't deserve it. And then, finally, she smiled. The real smile. The one that lit up her entire face and made me understand why people wrote songs about falling in love. So what happens now? She asked. Now we finish restoring this bedroom set because it's beautiful, and Harold would have wanted it completed properly. Then we lock up the studio, go get dinner somewhere that doesn't serve overpriced wine, and stop pretending that what's happening between us is complicated, when it's actually the simplest thing in the world, which is two people who love each other figuring out how to build a life together. Age is just a number, Rachel. But love? Love is everything. She kissed me then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and I understood that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as complications. Sometimes the person who changes everything shows up when you least expect them, carrying their own set of beautiful scars and the courage to believe in second chances. 6 months later, we opened a second location for our restoration business. A year after that, we bought the building that housed both the workshop and the studio. People in town still occasionally comment on our age difference, but it's usually in the context of admiring how happy we look together. And every morning when I wake up next to the woman who taught me that broken things can become beautiful again, I'm grateful that I was brave enough to tell her the truth about love, about age, and about the fact that sometimes the heart wants what it wants, regardless of what makes sense on paper. Because at 49, Rachel wasn't too old for love. She was exactly the right age to know how precious it was when it finally arrived. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.